Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Peter Rogers. As I hope you know, I'm an Associate Professor of Strategy here at the University of Leicester's School of Business, and I'm also your Director of the MBA programme. So a big hello from me, and I hope the course is going well. Today, I'm going to undertake the Lecture 1 of our new module, MN 7703. And today I'm going to introduce you to the subject of strategy and strategic management. In particular, the title of the lecture is Formulating Strategy, Planned and Incremental Approaches to Decision Making. So during the duration of this module, to provide some overview, we're going to be looking at some of the economic foundations of strategic decision making for the firm, and we're also going to look at some of the financial constraints and how financial issues are dealt with from a strategic perspective, looking in particular at how budgetary constraints and budgetary planning play a role in how firms develop their strategic decision making in order to maintain competitive advantage in the marketplace. Following this, we'll look again at some of the corporate and business level strategies before we'll look at finish the end of the module by looking at some very relevant and up-to-date issues within the world of business today in terms of business ethics and corporate social responsibility. So how a firm positions itself in a given market in which it resides and how it deals with other societal issues and how that plays an increasingly important role in its strategic decision making. However, as I've stated, today I'm going to provide you with a brief, hopefully interesting overview of the core subject of strategy and strategic management. We're going to be looking at the theoretical underlying mechanisms which have informed the development of strategic management over the years, and from this we're going to look at and kind of see the emergence of two very key approaches within the world of strategic management in terms of a planned approach, and then secondly an emergent approach to strategic management, and see what are the pros, what are the cons, what are the advantages, and what are the disadvantages of these two approaches. In terms of kind of straight away, a couple of definitions I put up here. Very important to state from the onset of understanding strategic management is that there are no universally agreed definitions for what is strategy, what is strategic management. We've got a quotation here from Andrews, 1971. Strategic management is the pattern of major objectives or goals and essential policies for achieving those goals stated in such a way as to define what business the company is in or is to be in and the kind of business it is or is to be. Similarly, Kay, 1993, talks about the strategy of the firm and providing an alignment between the firm's internal capabilities and also the external relationships it has within the wider environment in which it undertakes its business. Okay, so it talks about how the company decides to respond to its suppliers, customers, competitors, and also the wider social, economic, political environment in which it does its business. That's, in some respects, we call a prescriptive view. It's saying what are the prescriptive understandings of strategy. A more emergent view is an interesting quotation here from Lynn 2015. The emergent strategic management is a strategy whose final objective is unclear and whose elements are developed during the course of its life as the strategy proceeds. So already here, hopefully we can see the difference between a more prescriptive and the emergent view in terms of strategic management. Emergent view takes into account and has a kind of underlines and underscores the importance of dynamism. It understands how a strategy of a firm might change during the course of the firm's life. The firm might respond to things as it happens. It's important, as I always say to all my students, business does not take place, for example, in a political vacuum. Businesses are all located in different spaces. There might be a business that's located in Leicester, there might be a business in Ukraine, a business in New York, a business in Hong Kong. All these businesses are located in different political, social and economic environments. And for firms to be successful, they sometimes need to be responsive and understand the needs and what's considered normal, what's considered not in these specific different environments. Okay. It's sometimes about, for example, strategic management is about finding new market opportunities. It's seeing how can you maintain a competitive advantage over other firms in that marketplace over a period of time. The emergent view, as I've stated, underscores and takes into account the evolution of strategy within a firm level structure. So it's understanding the dynamism and change, and here we find the emergence of being important. So as I've stated right from the off, we have kind of two quite separate and quite different views on essentially what is strategy. The consensus view, as we can guess, is kind of a mixing these two things together, which again has played a role in the development of strategic management over the last 30 years. Nagatal 2007 have stated in a very important academic journal article, the field of strategic management deals with the major intended and emergent initiatives taken by managers on behalf of owners, involving the utilization of the firm's resources to enhance the performance of firms in their external environments. So it's taking into account both the intended goals and the intended actions of a firm, but also at the same time it's taking into account how these things might change in vis-a-vis the performance in the external markets in which the firm operates. Okay, so the use of the word intended takes into account both, you could argue, prescriptive and emergent perspectives in terms of strategic management. Okay, there's an understanding also, what do we mean by ownership? Okay, ownership might mean a firm is not owned solely by the shareholders who have shares in that company if it's a private company, but we also need to take into account the views and opinions of a wider amount of stakeholders in the organisation. We might have a firm who are its stakeholders, not only the shareholders, but it might also be the employees, it might be people in the city in which the firm is located, and the wider population. Okay. In terms of resources, we need to be quite wide in our understanding of strategies here. We can understand resource in terms of human capital, financial capital, physical assets, physical capital, okay, and the ability also for organizations to develop new resources themselves. Okay. One of the underlying arguments within strategic management, or not an argument, perhaps we could say it's an assumption, is the idea that the firm's sole underlying overarching goal and objective is to improve firm performance. However, the next question that comes from this is, how do we measure that performance? How do we know when a firm is doing well? If a firm is investing well, but the profits are very low at the moment, does that make the firm underperforming? Do we solely measure a firm's performance in terms of profits? Do we measure that in terms of the share price if the firm is on the stock exchange? Do we measure a firm's success in terms of its employees and how happy they are working at that organisation? How do we measure the performance in terms of measuring how, to what extent the strategy utilised within the firm is successful? Okay. Would it be more useful to look at how an organisation is potentially adding value? Is it adding value to itself? Is it adding value to its shareholders? Is it adding value to its employees and suppliers and customers? These are some alternative ways that we can look at the concept of performance. Okay. As I stated, businesses, firms working in the private sector, but also organisations working in the public sector. As you know, I'm an academic and I work at the University of Leicester. The university is located in the public sector. It also has strategies. This is an important thing to take into account during this module, that we're talking primarily about companies working in the private sector, but also do not underestimate the importance of strategies which take place for organisations working in the public sector and organisations, also non-governmental organisations, maybe working in the third sector. Having organisations like a health service, hospitals, the police. Of course, these organisations have strategies in order to improve their performance so they can help the general public better. So in order to understand which strategies we need to undertake, as organizations, whether it's a public sector organization like the police force or a private sector organization like, for example, an oil company, we need to understand what is the external environment. Okay? When we look at the external environment, what is important here? We need to look at what kind of government is there in the external environment. Okay? Is the government supportive if your company is an oil company? Is the government supportive of oil companies? Or is the government very negative towards oil companies? To what extent, for example, in the oil business, is there a very strong green and environmental agenda in that country? To what extent non-governmental organizations in that country might play a very important role in the development of public and social policy in terms of oil production in that country. Okay, so it's very important to understand the environment, the place in which you're undertaking your business. As I've mentioned before, just a few different places. Let's think of some countries where we're from and how they're different. You know, I was born in Britain, but I've done a lot of work, for example, in Russia, which is a very different country from Britain. Last weekend, I had a business trip to Hong Kong in the Far East, which again is a very, very different environment in which to do business. So companies, when they're organizing their strategies, need to think about how they can organize a strategy to optimize their performance in a given environment. We could ask questions such as to what extent a company, if it is operating, for example, it's a multinational company, if it's operating in a variety of different environments, to what extent the company should follow solely one overarching global strategy to deal with its business operations across the globe in America, Russia, Europe, China, the Arab world, or should we actually pay attention specifically to the importance of the environment in these different places? And as such, the firm develops different strategies in order to optimize its business performance in these specific environments. So that becomes more of a bottom-up, taking into account of the differences in terms of economic, social, and political context in the places in which the firm operates. Okay. Moving on, strategic management and competitive advantage. The vast majority of companies, certainly in the private sector, will be aiming to generate and maintain competitive advantage. In units 2 and 3, following this unit of the module, you will be learning hopefully about some of the economic foundations of strategic decision making, looking at some pure economic laws, including the laws of competitive advantage, which is about how does a company gain a superior performance relative to other competitors. How does your company stand out, stand above, and is better than one of its competitors? For example, Google, Apple, FC Barcelona. Who are its competitors? Who is Google's competitors? Who are Apple's competitors? Think about your own businesses. Who are your chief competitors? How do you provide a better service or a better product to your customers in order to maintain a competitive advantage and maintain an income stream and ultimately profitability within your organization? Okay. And as we're talking about here, the importance of sustainability. A company or a firm or a university can generate and can create a competitive advantage for one day. However, how do we generate this to take place over a long period of time? Okay, how do you maintain and generate strategic policies in order to create sustainable competitive advantage? Coca-Cola, I've put there as an example, is a classic example of a company in the soft drinks trade which has been the market leader for 60, 70 years and maybe even longer. Okay, how does Coca-Cola stay ahead of all of its competitors? Okay. Competitive disadvantage, moving on, is obviously what companies are not wanting to achieve, which is underperformance, is when they're doing worse than their competitors. And that's obviously a position which is extremely dangerous, because once you're in a position of competitive disadvantage, it's quite difficult to regain your foothold in the market. Okay. Competitive parity. in terms of a definition, involves performance of two firms at the same level. They're operating at a very similar level at the same time. Okay. So hopefully I've just been providing some kind of broad overviews of what is strategy and what is strategic management. Just in this slide 8, I'm just going to very briefly talk about levels of strategy: corporate level, business level, and functional level. This actually, the levels of strategy, will form the basis of a lecture further on in our module. So there's no need to go into great detail today in this lecture, but I thought it's important to include this slide in today's lecture just to give you a flavour of how strategy operates in different organisations. And on that note, it's perhaps important to think about our own companies. What sort of companies do we work in? Public sector organisations like I do, the University of Leicester? Or do you work in a small private sector organisation? To what extent do you have strategic levels throughout the company? Academics within the field of strategic management talk about the corporate level strategy. And this looks at what is the overall scope of an organisation. Okay, the University of Leicester will have its overall university level strategic plan. This looks at how the university is trying to achieve its strategic objectives at the overall university level over the next 5 or 10 years. Okay, it will look at how value is added to each parts of the organisational whole. Okay, so if this is a multinational organisation, we might be looking at its business operations in China, its business operations in Latin America, its business operations in North America. It might have different industrial segments in which it's taking place. The corporate level strategy is the overall strategy of the wider company. Okay. In comparison with this, moving on to the business level strategy, this is looking at how individual businesses within the wider company compete in particular markets. Okay, so it's saying how to smaller businesses which are part of a wider company, how do they compete, how do they maintain, how do they create and generate competitive advantage and then maintain sustainable competitive advantage in those marketplaces. From the business level strategy, these obviously lead into the corporate level strategy above that. Okay. Finally, at the kind of lower end, we look at the functional level strategy. This is looking at components of an organization. How do different parts of an organization deliver effectively the wider corporate and business level strategies in terms of resources, processes, and people? How do they implement the strategic policies which have been agreed at the corporate level, which will be the board level of a large organization? So how do people, it's often said at the coal face, at the real-time parts of the business, how do they generate strategies in order to maintain the business level and corporate level strategies above them? Okay, so for example, looking at the organization in which I work, which is a university, we have a university and we have maybe 3 or 4 faculties. There might be a faculty of social sciences, there might be a faculty of engineering, there might be a faculty of medicine. Okay, these all grow into the wider university. And then we take maybe the faculty of social science. Within the faculty, there might be 10 departments. One department is the department I work in, which is the business school. But there will be other departments like sociology, maybe social policy. Okay, these are all different units within the wider university, and each of these smaller units also have their own strategies. One of the key challenges for universities in the public sector, obviously, but for firms in the private sector, is to create an alignment, to make sure that strategies at the smaller level, these feed in rationally and coherently into the strategies at the wider and deeper firm level. Okay, we need an alignment and coherency between these. Otherwise, different parts of one organization will be competing against each other. And this is not obviously a good thing to happen within an organization, because the organization needs to be competing or utilizing its resources most efficiently in order to compete with its competitors in the external marketplace, rather than expanding and utilizing using up important and scarce resources, competing within its own organizational structures. So, very broadly, I'm going to throw a few questions out to you. Why is strategic management important? These are some big questions. Why should we be interested? Why should we be bothered about the management of strategy within an organizational setting? Why, for example, is any company successful? Let's think of some companies we know in the world today. Google. Tell me anybody, or please send me an email if you haven't used Google in the last 24 hours. Yeah? Why is Google so successful? Okay. I'm talking to you using an Apple Mac laptop. Apple as a company. Why has it become so incredibly successful in the last 10 years? Think of some other successful companies. Okay. Why have they become so incredibly successful? Coca-Cola we mentioned, soft drinks manufacturer. Why has no other company entered that market and managed to become the market leader? We've got companies like Pepsi, but it's never overtaken Coca-Cola to become the global market leader. Okay, think about companies in different fields around the world. Why are they successful? What have they done to achieve success? And not only over a very short period of time, but very often over a very long period of time. Think about successful aeroplane companies. British Airways, Lufthansa, German company, KLM. What do these what do these companies have, and how do they use them in order to maintain success? Okay. Another question we're going to talk about, and this will certainly form, as I mentioned at the start of today's lecture, we're going to look at in a lot more detail in the final couple of lectures of this module. What are the social environmental responsibilities do firms have when developing and implementing a strategy? From a very crude economic perspective, of course, if a firm should be trying to achieve profit maximization. What does profit maximization mean? It basically means try and get as much profit as quickly as possible. So, for example, if a firm produces a product at a very, very low price and then manages to sell that product at a high price, the difference between the high price it sells to its customers and the low price it takes to produce it will produce a bigger profit. So in the short term, this is potentially a great idea. This is a good example we could use this in terms of garment manufacture, clothes manufacture around the world. We've seen as a result of the forces of globalization, increasingly Western companies which are involved in clothes manufacture, clothes shops, they've outsourced the manufacturing of these clothes to developing economies in the Far East of Asia, economies like Bangladesh or economies like Cambodia. Why have the companies done this? For one very, very, very simple reason, is labor is incredibly cheap in Cambodia, in Bangladesh. So organizations manufacturing clothes can pay workers extremely low prices in these countries and then sell the products back home in Leicester or Chicago or New York or Paris at high prices. As a result of this, they will make huge profits. However, you say to yourself, what are the problems here? Okay, to what extent does a firm have responsibilities in terms of its social responsibilities? There are issues here in terms of the use of child labour. Is it acceptable to pay to employ children? I would obviously argue no. In terms of the world of environmental issues, a company might be able to extract resources like oil or gas or chemicals and sell these products to make huge profits. But what about the company's responsibilities, wider responsibilities to the wider environment, not only to the globe, but also, for example, to the city in which maybe the chemical factory is located? What happens when the production of chemicals in a certain city has knock-on effects on the health of children and people within the city in which the chemical factory is located? Does the firm have a responsibility for those people and those people's health? Okay, so the company needs to try and develop a strategy and also to implement a strategy which takes into account as I've stated, the firm's position within a wider environment, an external environment. How does a firm control that? Okay. Next question. What enables firms to gain and sustain a competitive advantage over time? As we said, in terms of competitive advantage, this is becoming more successful, having something that makes a difference between yourself and your competitors in a marketplace. How does a firm manage to gain that competitive advantage and also sustain it? To what extent strategy is an important part of that? Firms need to develop a strategy in order to seek the competitive advantage which they will need in order to engender profit maximization. Okay. Then we're going to look at this fourth question. How can a firm's managers influence performance? Okay. When we're looking in the social sciences at companies in terms of how well they do or not, is it the case that the firm has a simple structure, okay, and the company's business will continue like that, irrespective of the input of its managers? Or is it the case that company managers at the individual level have a huge potential impact to make on the performance in terms of firm leadership, in terms of the development and then subsequent implementation of strategy as well for the firm going forwards? Okay, so to what extent, again, we can look at our own companies and organizations in which we work in. How do our firms, how do our companies in which we organize ourselves, how do managers make a difference? Do they make a positive difference to the firm level performance, or do they make a negative difference? How does this affect the firm? Okay. Next question. Where should a firm compete? Should it compete solely in the marketplace in which it's existing now? Or should a firm, for example, try and seek to internationalize? If a firm is being successful in one market, is it the case of it should use resources to try and be successful in other markets around the world? However, a second question which follows from that, and taking into account the importance of different firm level environments, is we need to think about to what extent, if a company is successful in one environment, for example, Hong Kong, if that firm goes to work and try and compete in a different environment, for example, Russia, is it the case that naturally that company will simply be successful in that environment? Or is it the case that the company might end up having some struggles in that new environment, and also as a result of that might spend lots of resources and essentially waste those resources which could have been used back at home in Hong Kong? So those are some of the strategic decisions the management and owners of a company need to think about. Okay. The next question is the classic question. Why do once great firms fail? We can potentially think about lots of examples of firms that were very large companies, they're hugely successful, and then they collapse. What are the reasons for the company's collapse? Is it they suddenly just lost them? Did the competitors just emerge and take all their market share, and the firms didn't have the time to respond? What are the reasons behind the failure of companies in any given organization? To what extent a different strategic approach from the firms might have actually engendered a different outcome and the firms actually surviving rather than failing in that given marketplace? Okay. The next question is, how should a firm compete? Should it compete using all of its resources? Should it compete simply using a specific business unit within its wider firm operations in order to compete? This is some of the questions strategically. How should a firm enter a market? Should it invest lots of money into the processes, or should it maybe invest just small amounts of money and see how it goes over a period of time? Okay. So, as I've tried to explain here, strategic management is dealing with some of the most fundamental questions which affect any organization, whether this is a public sector organization, the police or a university, or a private sector organization. A very small level company, it might be a company working online with only one person, or it might be a huge multinational company like BP, which has thousands of people working for it all over the globe. All of these different levels of organization have strategic management issues at the heart of them. Okay. Strategic management involves and requires taking into account the impact of decisions across the entire organization, maybe at the micro level, but also at the macro level. One of the central qualms, though, of strategic management is the idea that the firm, certainly in the private sector, needs to generate and then sustain competitive advantage. If a firm is not able to generate and then sustain competitive advantage, it will not be able to make profits. As a result of its lack of profitability over a period of time, it will fail. Okay, so what we're looking at is what are the strategies that companies need to utilize, need to plan, and then implement in order for the organization to survive. Survival, as we've said here, is a minimum objective, and then from survival is for the firm to try and engender strategies in order to generate strategic growth. Okay, so how does the firm generate value and add value? Okay, these are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves. Okay, let's moving on. Personal strategy. Okay, Lady Gaga. Hopefully you all think her music is amazing. Let's just look at some of the statistics about Lady Gaga. In April 2015, she sold an estimated 28 million albums, 140 million singles worldwide across the globe. Lady Gaga has become a hugely popular pop artist in the world of popular culture over the past 5 or 6 years. She's got 6 Grammy Awards, Golden Globe, MTV Video Music Awards, a hugely successful global pop artist. Okay, but let's try and analyze, let's try and take a step backwards and analyze to what extent, how has she just been successful? Is it because she has a good voice? Is it because her songs are good? What are the reasons that have generated the success of Lady Gaga? We can analyze these across 5 dimensions. The Gaga vision, what does she embody? Okay, in terms of an understanding of the environment in which her music is taking place, an understanding of what her customers need and want, and also understanding what are the constraints and context of the industry, the pop industry at the moment across the world. Okay. Then we look at issues around leveraging competencies, addressing weaknesses, how Lady Gaga and her business operations deal strategically and hone in on advantages and also try and minimize certain risks in terms of their operationalization. Okay, and also then issues finally in terms of continual renewal. Okay, how the ideas within the image of Lady Gaga continues and makes it more and more kind of amenable for its own customers to then buy further products. Okay, turning from this, of course, from the personal strategy of Lady Gaga, we can perhaps look at what are our own personal strategies. Okay, as we put here, an understanding of these core concepts within the field of strategic management theory and practice will help us understand and distinguish ourselves from other people, from other candidates. Okay, we can use some of the core theories within the field of strategic management to look at how we make decisions in terms of our own lives. Okay, for example, if we have a company or whatever, we can look at environmental analysis to see where are the high growth trends. Okay, we can look at what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses. Okay, in terms of our own careers and business development, we can look at what's important for specifically generalist managers and what's important for much more specialisms like strategic consultants, for example. Competitive advantage, as I've stated, is incredibly important. What is your competitive advantage? What makes you a better, for example, business analyst than somebody else? Okay. When we're thinking about where we want to work, the final question, what kind of organization will allow you to leverage your strengths and remain engaged in work? Where you're working today, is this the kind of organization you've always wanted to work at? Is it the case that this organization enables you to build upon all of your strengths? Or is it the case that your strengths might be better used in a different organizational space? Okay. Well, you could also try and reflect as well in terms of strategies. What are your strategic management strategies in terms of learning upon and during this MBA program? I assume that the aim of going on to this Masters of Business Administration program at the University of Leicester is to achieve the degree at the end of your studies. In order to achieve that degree, what strategies are you undertaking? How are you planning these strategies? Does this involve listening to lectures? Does it involve engaging in tutorials and seminars? Does it involve reading? Does it involve, for example, talking to your tutors? Does it involve, for example, talking to other students? Do you talk to other students on Blackboard? Do you talk to other students just on the phone? Okay. Does it involve investing in more money to buy books, for example, to buy more and more books? What are the strategies you use in order to maintain your MBA studies? Is it involving, again, allocation, time management examples? For example, you have your own working lives, but also you have your MBA. Does it involve managing your time effectively so you have time for your studies as well as time to undertake your mainstream business? Okay, so we can look, when we're looking at strategic management, we have a clear opportunity to reflect back on ourselves and think about how do we strategize in our own lives. Okay, how do you use strategies? How do you plan strategies? How do these develop over a period of time in our lives, whether in just our lives in general or in our working lives? How do these affect and are affected by the firms in which we do our business? Okay. In terms of strategic management, very broadly, and this is useful to just provide some context to this lecture and the wider module, to be honest, is we can look at strategic analysis, strategic development, and strategic implementation. Okay, so strategic analysis involves providing an analysis of what we've got, which resources do we have. We can provide an analysis of a company, its environment, where is it based? Is it based in America, Russia, China? Okay, what's that environment like? Is that environment very good? Is it useful in terms of its tax regime, in terms of the ability to employ staff? Okay, is the environment healthy and open to foreign companies, for example? Or is it the case of that environment is not very conducive for business? Okay, resources, incredibly important for a company. What resources do you have available? Most important resource, you might argue, is not financial capital, but it's potentially human capital. The people you have in your organization. Who are they? What are they like? What skills do they have? What capabilities do they have? Do they have the ability to generate firm level strategies which are going to generate and maintain competitive advantage and hence profit maximization for the firm for the next few years? If they don't, what are the ways you can do to enhance the human capital within your organization? Does that mean employing new people and trying to recruit new people? Or does it involve maybe sending existing people on training courses in order to improve their skill sets? Okay. Missions, objectives. To what extent the company has, it would probably be the corporate level strategy of a company. To what extent this aligns with the business level strategy of an organization and also functional level strategies of the organizations. How do these align with each other or not? Okay. Moving on to strategic development, we can look at some of the options, some of the choices that companies have in terms of their strategic development. When we're thinking about how a company might invest strategically, we say, what are the options for a company, a given company? What are the differences between these different choices? Okay. Finally, we're going to look at strategic implementation, and this is very important, and it's going to be a kind of an interesting part of today's lecture, which is to look at the difference between strategic planning and strategic implementation. Like in all walks of life, the differences between this is what we're planning to do to this is what we did, sometimes there is a difference. Lots of people say we're going to do X, and then in reality, X does not occur. X does not happen. Why? So it's extremely important, obviously, for a company, whilst it spends a lot of time and resources in developing a strategic plan and its own company-wide or business level, corporate level strategy, how is that company going to implement those strategies? How is it going to allocate resources? Okay, is it going to put all of its resources in one basket, or is it going to try and allocate them in different ways? Here we look at issues in terms of strategic planning and control. How do you plan your organizational strategic development? How do you allocate people within your organization in order to maintain the implementation of the company level wider strategy? Okay. On a very basic level, the kind of core, I suppose, intellectual question we're looking at in terms of strategies, how are they formulated? How do you develop a strategy? Is strategy developed through consciously intended, sequential, and rationally driven plans? Or is it the case that strategy is much more complicated, much more dirty and mixed up, and strategy is very dynamic and continuous and is constantly adapting? Okay. One of the key points that we need to look at today is to understand, as the title suggests for this lecture, is strategy as process. To understand how the evolution of strategy and understanding the dynamism within this. Okay. So let's look at some of the core theories which have driven and kind of provided an underlying for the development of the concept and themes of strategy and strategic management within the wider business and management discipline in the world of academia. The dominant perspective, in terms of generally called strategic planning, has its theoretical underpinnings, very importantly, in the world of military planning. Okay, also in the theories of Adam Smith and the Rational Economic Man, Taylor and Fiole's principles of scientific management as well. Okay, within the dominant kind of understanding of military planning, which then became strategic planning for the firm, is an understanding that strategy is a rational process. It involves individuals, and normally the CEO, the kind of the chief boss and the chief strategic architect, making rational decisions on the basis of the materials and on the basis of the information in which he or she has at the fingertips. Okay. Also, and crucially here, within this theorization, there is a clear demarcation, there is a clear separation between the formulation of strategy and the implementation of strategy. Within this theory, these are disconnected. Okay. So here we can see the basic model of strategic planning. We can look on the left-hand side here is you can have the recognition and definition of a problem. You can search for alternative courses of action. You gather data, as much information you have on that subject, and analyze that data. You can then identify and apply a choice criteria, evaluate some of the alternatives, and then finally implement a preferred course of action. Okay, and from that there will be given outcomes. Okay, within this kind of strategic planning approach, there are some key foundational issues which are incredibly important to take place. Most importantly, this is a belief in rational analysis. Okay, whilst theoretically this might seem commonsensical, one must always, as social scientists, be wary, be careful about the use of rational analysis. Do we all behave rationally all the time? In terms of economic theory, yes, we do. But in terms of reality, do we always behave rationally? When, for example, I give an example, somebody telephones and says, oh, when you're going to be getting home, we're going to be having some food later. And then next minute, your friend sitting next to you in a car says, oh, Peter, would you like some chocolate? And you go, oh, okay. Is this a rational decision when you know you're going to be eating a meal in 20 minutes' time? You could argue potentially no, but why have you made the decision to eat the chocolate? maybe because you think, oh, it's nice. Is that rationally a good idea or not? Companies and organizations and individuals very often don't behave in rational manners. Okay? The key strategic planning approach has this underlying belief in the rationality of economic behavior. Okay? Secondly, the second key assumption is this idea of a separation of formulation from implementation. This idea that you can separate these two distinct processes within the world of strategic decision making. Okay. Again, thirdly, this assumption of the goal is purely one of profit maximization. Okay, we've talked briefly about issues around business ethics and issues around corporate social responsibility. Within these kind of understandings, to what extent these kind of contest the idea of a company of pure profit maximization? Is it the case, instead of simply trying to achieve huge profits in the short term, that in reality a company needs to take into consideration wider societal issues in terms of its business ethics and corporate social responsibility policies? As a result of this, these policies might cost a small amount of money, but in the long run, this enables the company to create and endure and sustain competitive advantage amongst its competitors. Okay. The other, fourthly, kind of foundational kind of assumption is return on investment is seen as a key indicator of strategic performance. Okay. There's also a decentralized divisional form, and there's often a separation, as I've talked about here, of between policy, which we can understand as strategy, from operations tactics. Okay, there's the idea that a policy is made which is kind of quite detached from reality in terms of it's written down on a piece of paper and then it is simply operationalized into the workforce. There is no understanding of how the realities of what happens in the workplace might feed back into the policy and strategy. Okay, so in terms of chronology, this is an understanding of the sequential nature. This is the deliberate, rational. One step leads to a second step, leads to a third step, which leads to a fourth step. The process is wholly chronological and sequential. Okay. So, continuing to look at the planning approach, we need to understand again what are some wider assumptions we're understanding here. Is, as I've mentioned, this understanding belief that managers operate in rational and logical ways. As we all know, as human beings, we're all A, imperfect, and B, as we all, I'm sure, know, sometimes we often act in completely not logical, completely not irrational, not rational ways. This is a kind of fundamental kind of points of human nature. This happens in our working lives and in our wider lives. Okay. There's also the assumption within these theorizations that the external environment in which a company is doing its business is sufficiently knowledgeable and knowable to predict future developments with confidence. As a result of that, the company can forecast changes and plans. Okay, I think you're going to be looking at these issues in terms of economic forecasting in the following units, units 2 and 3, and with kind of quite a critical eye on this in terms of let's think about major things that have happened in our world over the last 10 years in terms of the economic crash, the global economic crisis from 2008. Did lots of people predict this? Of course not. Okay, this simply happened. Banks collapsed. There's huge differences in terms of exchange rates. This was a huge crash in the market in 2008, which was not predicted. Okay, so there needs to be again here a recognition of the fact that to what extent we can ever fully understand the external environment in which our businesses are trying to undertake their actions. Okay. The third important assumption of the planning approach is that how decisions are made within the organization, it's assumed that these decisions are made in an ordered, logical, sequential way. It's assumed that managers and leaders and bosses use all the information given to them and available to them in a theoretical sense in order to inform the correct decision making. Again, We only need to look at our own lives potentially to think about to what extent this really takes place. To what extent are organisational decisions always taken in such a logical and rational way? Okay. Finally, is the belief, the assumption that there's sufficient data has been collected and time has been used analysing this data in order to make the correct strategic decisions. Is it the case, again, moving back into the real world, that we always analyse all the available data to us before we make decisions? Okay. Is it actually possible to do that? And what would be the effects on a company if it spent all its time analysing data? Okay. Would it mean a more efficient and more profitable kind of firm as a result of the correct strategic decisions? Or would it mean that the company in reality would lose and waste lots of scarce resources in terms of time and money analysing every piece of data available? Okay. So hopefully I've provided a kind of a brief overview of the dominant planning approach which developed in the field, in the genesis of the field of strategic management and strategy over the last 50 years. This was kind of the key points to take on board, the idea of the kind of rational economic man can plan using all the available data available. As a result of this, generate strategies which then in a different stage are implemented, and this can create competitive advantage and profits for the company. This is based historically, as I mentioned at the start, in the field of military planning. Okay. And I've outlined some of the key assumptions within that as well. Moving on, Henry Mintzberg, as a key figure in the world of strategic management, has provided some important critiques of the planning approach to strategic management. Okay. Henry Mintzberg talks about three key kind of criticisms of the strategic planning approach. These are the great fallacies of predetermination, the fallacy of detachment, and the fallacy of formalization. Okay. When we're looking at the fallacy of predetermination, this essentially means that companies in any businesses, in any markets, can obviously test and can obviously observe and analyze the marketplace. You can see that there are certain repetitive patterns that take place. Lots of businesses are very seasonal. People go on holiday in the summer. People buy more fruits in the summer. They buy, for example, in Britain, lots of food and lots of alcohol at Christmas time to celebrate around the event of Christmas in the calendar in Britain. As a result of this, companies are able to guess and kind of anticipate and plan for the increased consumer demand prior to Christmas. Okay. However, it's important to add and also to notice that in an increasingly globalized world, it's sometimes increasingly difficult to predict and plan. It's important that a company doesn't just make the same planning year after year in terms of consumer demand, because as a result of the interdependencies within the world in which we live in today, sometimes things change and change very, very quickly. So instead of having simply set strategic planning in place, is it the case that companies need to be more strategically agile? They need to be much more ready to make very quick changes as differences in the markets emerge. Excuse me, I'll just have a glass of water. So moving on from the fallacy of predetermination, we have the fallacy of detachment. Okay. Mintzberg criticizes the theory of strategic planning in terms of the inability to understand, for example, the symbiosis of strategy and its implementation. Okay. He argues that it's impossible to detach. It's impossible to isolate strategy and strategic policy from the strategic implementation. He argues how this needs to be understood as much more of a dynamic process in which both of these inform each other all the time, and this is constantly changing and evolving. Okay. Mintzberg argues that strategy needs to have some levels of responsiveness to it. It's a process in which, during the period of implementation, the company will understand what is working well, what is not working well, and as such is able to respond in maybe a very agile way and then change the strategy again, which then informs the output and implementation of this. And these level changes, these levels of strategic agility, take place at all levels of the organization. This is not just at the kind of shop floor level. This can take place at the corporate level, the business level, the functional level of an organizational, of the firm's organization. The third major critique by Mintzberg is the fallacy of formalization. Okay, very often the critique of large companies is that the CEO and maybe 2 or 3 other people at the top of the organization look at simply company charts, company figures, and see this, and from this organize and create the company's wider strategies. Okay, the critique is this fails to take into account what is actually happening within the company's operations on a daily basis. As Mintzberg quotes here from an article in 1994, none of those fancy planning charts ever contained a single box that explained how strategy is actually to be created. Okay, so Mintzberg's calling for an appreciation of how strategy evolves within the workforce, within the environment in which the firm is taking place. There needs to be an understanding of this so it's not detached from the realities. Okay. As I mentioned at the onset, and we're going to talk through today, from the emergence, the genesis of this strategic planning approach, we've seen the emergence of kind of 2 kind of different arms, a prescriptive and also an emergent approach to strategy. A prescriptive strategy is one whose objectives have been defined in advance. The main elements have been developed since before the strategy commences. Okay, so this is very similar, akin to the strategic planning approach. We have a strategy and then it's detached, and then we implement this strategy going forwards. In comparison, and different from this, we have the idea of an emergent strategy. And this is one where the final wider objective is unclear for the company. Okay, these elements are developed during the course of the firm's life. Within an emergent strategic understanding, strategy proceeds as the company proceeds itself. Okay, let's look at this graph here in terms of prescriptive strategic process. From here, we have a company would undertake an analysis of the environment, an analysis of its resources. Okay, and then from this would look at develop what are its objectives, what's the mission of the organization. It would maybe develop 2 or 3 different options, strategic options the company could take. And from this, it might choose option 1, or it might choose to undertake option 2 or option 3. And after this, it would finally implement that given option. So it's initially to make some very firm analysis of the environment in which it's working in and what are its options and what are its resources, develop 2 or 3 strategic options, decide on which is the strategic option, and then implement this. This would be a prescriptive strategic process. Okay. In comparison, we see here the dynamism within an emergent strategic process. Okay. We have analysis of resources and environment analysis, growing into the mission objectives of the stakeholders, but an understanding that these are not set in stone. These are not firmly fixed. Strategy develops from this, but takes place in terms of trials of different options. And these then feed back into how the company analyzes its own resources and how it analyzes its own environment. Okay, so in comparison to a strategic planning approach, within an emergent strategic process, we see much more experimentation. We see the experimental nature of this strategy. It's extremely difficult to describe and to guess, but it's also we need to understand the essential nature of this. This is taking into account how companies work within environments which are constantly changing, and then how does the company's strategy evolve in response to that. Okay. Again, we see here at the top the prescriptive, and then below it the emergent approaches to issues around strategic analysis, strategic development, and then leading to strategic implementation. At the top here, which is the prescriptive approach, the company will analyze the environment, the resources, the mission, objectives, and the stakeholders. From this, it will develop a strategy. It will evaluate and look at what is the formation of the strategy, what is the structure, and how the company should then implement these strategies going forwards. Below this, we see the emergent approach to strategic management. Here we see the symbiosis, interaction, and dynamism between strategic analysis and strategic development. This is a constant interplay informing them, and as a result of that, and actually within the process of strategic development, we see strategic implementation taking place at the same time. This is much more an appreciation of the interaction between these two different approaches. Okay, I've provided hopefully some useful theoretical background to these two dominant approaches in the world of strategic management. I'm now going to give you some examples of terms of prescriptive strategy. Singapore Airlines and the Emirates Group. Okay, they both started as small regional airlines. Both of them, importantly, crucially, had government backing. Okay, they developed important prescriptive strategies. They looked at what are their skills based on a reputation, on very good levels of customer service. They've invested in human capital. They've invested in staff training and make sure their employees are happy. They've also invested in assets, in terms of physical assets, in terms of very modern planes, and developed modern airports. If any of you have flown through Dubai, it's an incredibly modern airport. Okay, and also have levels of cooperation involved. Okay, so that's an example of a prescription strategy. The Virgin Group, again, Richard Branson, business opportunities are like buses. There's always another coming along, is a quotation from Richard Branson. Okay, here we look at the issues of trial and error, successes and failures. When we look at Richard Branson as the head of the Virgin Group, we see how there's been numerous attempts to enter different businesses: Virgin Atlantic Flying, Virgin Trains, Virgin Media, Virgin Galactic, trying to send people up through space. Some of Richard Branson and Virgin Group's operations have been successful. Some of them have been failures, but then they've turned it around and changed it into a different thing. So these are examples of an emergent strategy, how it evolves over a period of time. Okay, important here is for us to understand and to take into account, whilst we see these two distinct forms of strategic management, the prescriptive approach and an emergent approach, let's look at now excuse me, some of the limitations of a prescriptive strategy. One of the key limitations of a prescriptive strategy is the difficulty to cope with an uncertain environment. Okay, let's look at, for example, the mobile phone environment. Nokia, as I'm sure you all know, was a key leading market player in the 1990s. Today, Nokia has lost huge amounts of its market share. The mobile phone network environment has been hugely uncertain, evolving rapidly over the last 10 to 15 years. Okay, so one of the dangers of having a set in stone, very clear prescriptive strategy is the inability for a company to change its strategies quickly. Examples of the telecommunications market demonstrate the need for companies, rather than following prescriptive strategies, is for them to follow strategies which enable the firm to maintain strategic agility, to be able to respond to changes quickly. Okay, within this, the limitations of prescriptive strategy is this assumption that companies can forecast for years ahead. As I talked about in terms of the economic crash, nobody or very few people predicted the economic crash of 2008. However, within this theory of prescriptive strategy is the assumption companies can forecast for years to come, which in reality doesn't align to reality. Okay, Thirdly, there's this assumption that companies can always make firm plans. Okay, and this, for example, is incredibly difficult when we're living in a period like we're living today, in which there's rapid technological change. Things are changing in the world of technology all the time. As a result of that, it's extremely difficult for firms to plan accordingly. Okay. The fourth key assumption, and it's in itself a limitation, is the idea that strategies are logical and can just be managed in a rational, sequential manner. This doesn't take into account the difficulties of human management and management learning in practice within an office or within a wider workplace. Okay. The next limitation is one I've talked about, is the limitation with the understanding of implementation acting as a separate distinctive phase that only starts to occur after strategy is agreed at a kind of theoretical level. This leads into the next section, which is the kind of lack of attention, lack of underscoring of the importance of innovation and how innovation takes place within workplaces and how innovation takes place within the firm, and how this kind of seeps in during with the development of knowledge transfer and knowledge creation within and across organizations. The prescriptive strategic approach doesn't take into account how things innovate in terms of that. Okay. As a result of that, the prescriptive strategy looks at how a firm can create and maintain competitive advantages by solely looking at what are the existing market opportunities in front of the company. It doesn't seek to look beyond and see what are the market opportunities further afield. To what extent a company operating in 5 different markets today actually has the opportunity to enter 25 new markets over the next 10 years. There needs to be an appreciation again of the evolving and dynamic nature of underlying markets and environments across the world in which we live in. Okay, so there I've tried to outline some of the core limitations of the prescriptive strategy. Okay, moving on, I'll try and outline now some of the limits of an emergent strategy. Okay, and these are obviously quite different. Okay, one of the key limitations is, whilst we can see that it's very dangerous in terms of a prescriptive strategy to be too ordered, to put too much energy into the planning process and not to understand excuse me, the dynamism within the everyday world of work, it's also a limitation to, and also an unrealistic expectation to expect the leaders, the bosses of an organization to simply just let companies do what they want. Okay? The argument here is, even though environments change, even though companies change, even though employees come and go within an organization, even though there is lots of change and dynamism within the environments, the countries, and the markets in which businesses are doing their work, nevertheless, a company needs to have an overall overarching strategy. This provides, whilst you shouldn't potentially not take it word for word, this all the same provides some sort of guidance for the company. Okay. Again, a limitation of the emergent strategy is the understanding of there might need to be some sort of strategic overview from the centre. Whilst it's very good to allocate resources into different subunits of a company, at the same time, how are these subunits then subsequently managed? Is it not a danger that subunits start to compete amongst themselves without some overarching guidance from the centre? Okay. There's a danger within this, that there needs to be some overarching responsibility for the final decision making that takes place within any organisational setting. Moving on to the next limitation, the argument goes that in certain industries, such as telecommunications, for example, broadband development, strategy actually does need to be fixed. Strategy does need to be planned for. Strategy does need to be prescriptive. Okay, it takes years to implement, for example, and as a result of that, a key strategy needs to be implemented, it needs to be developed and then implemented. Okay. The penultimate one here is looking at the issues of rational decision making, which states that whilst, of course, as I've been arguing to some degree, there is degrees of irrationality within the decision making of managers and also consumers, people argue as well that there's evidence that says that following an economic theory of rational decision making is actually still potentially a better chance of success than just taking your chances. Okay. There's a danger of saying, whilst we don't want to look at things in such an ordered and rational and structured fashion, that there's also a danger that being extremely laissez-faire generates huge levels of uncertainty and constant changing, which leads certainly to chaos. So instead of structure leading to profit, we have chaos leading to lower levels of profitability. Okay. So as I've outlined in today's lecture, we have these two clear and divergent approaches to understanding strategy as a process. Okay. We have the prescriptive, and we also have the emergent processes of strategic processes. One of the ideas that, and one of the attempts has been made within the field of strategic management over the last few years is to try and integrate, is to try and bring together the successes and the differences between these two processes. One of the ideas to develop kind of the clear and implement clear and logical plans, that's kind of a prescriptive approach, and simultaneously allow for experimentation with different strategies, and that would take into place a more emergent approach. What does this mean in practice? Okay, what it means in practice is, in terms of a company's overall strategy, a company might have some parts of strategies which are actually quite prescriptively planned. There's clear objectives, there's clear strategies. Okay, but in other forms, the company might have more emergent approaches where when new ideas occur, when there's some innovation, the company then puts in some additional resources to that. So the company has the ability to be strategically agile and respond to changing consumer demand, to respond to a different environment. Okay, so it might be the case that outcomes are actually quite uncertain, but the company has the ability and maintains some levels of experimentation. Okay, in its business. So it's important to understand when we're thinking about this that these are inherently simply academic theories. They're academic theories which we're using to try and understand the world in which we live in. As we go through this module, we can look at and try and reflect, and the reflection is actually quite important to see what does our practice tell us? What does the practice we have in the world in which we live and work tell us about these practices? When we're thinking about the organisations in which we work and live in, I work at the University of Leicester. To what extent the University of Leicester has forms of prescriptive strategy? To what extent does the University of Leicester have emergent strategic processes also taking place? And potentially these emergent processes might be taking place at the same time as the implementation of prescriptive forms of strategic practice. Okay. Here, finally, we've got a very clear outline of the different perspectives we've been looking at today: the planning perspective and an emergent perspective. Okay. So in terms of emphasis, the planning perspective looks at deliberateness over emergentness. Okay. The nature of this strategy in terms of a planning perspective is intentionally designed. The strategy is designed intentionally from the analysis of the information given in terms of analysis of resources and the analysis of the external environment. And from that, an intentionally designed strategy is formulated. In comparison, the emergent perspective underlines and underscores the gradualness of how strategy is formulated. It states that strategy is evolved over a period of time as the firm undertakes its business in a given environment. Okay, it's a clear point here, the difference between figuring out again and finding out. In terms of the formation of a strategy, in the planning perspective, you need to figure it out. You need to analyze the information given to you, and as a result of that, you can create and develop a strategy for your firm to then implement going forwards. In an emergent perspective, it's much more a sense of evolving, how you find out about your strategy as your company develops its organization. Okay. As a result of that, in terms of formation process, within a planning perspective, there's an understanding of the formal structures within an organization, whilst in comparison in the emergent perspective, we're looking at a very fragmented and unstructured levels of strategic formation. Okay. In terms of sequentialism, the ideas are, as I said, first think and analyze, and then implement, as these are two very separate phases within the world of strategic planning. In the emergent perspective, is this understanding, as I've said a couple of times, I'm sure already today, is the idea of thinking and acting together. They take place and inform each other at the same time. Okay. In terms of planning perspective, on the focus on strategy, in terms of it's a pattern of decisions. These are planned decisions. Okay. In emergent perspective, we might underline the patterns of action, the patterns of behavior, and how then that rolls back and informs the company's emergent strategy as it develops itself. Decision making within a planning perspective is incredibly hierarchical. Lots of attention is given to the chief strategic architect. This is normally the chief executive officer, the CEO of an organization, who then might have a kind of a chief senior management board. These people make the decisions, strategic decisions, which are then implemented into the wider company. In an emergent perspective, is an understanding of the political nature of decision making, how decisions are often being negotiated, how decisions are often being mediated across and within different organizational levels. Okay. In terms of the focus of decision making, we see from a planning perspective, we need to look and analyze at what are our resources, and then we need to coordinate and allocate them to the optimum level. As a result of this, we make a strategy to try and optimize the allocation and coordination of these resources. Okay. In an emergent perspective, we understand the nature of experimentation, trying things and see how it works. Okay. In terms of looking into the future, strategic planning perspective has an understanding, belief in the importance and the possibility even for forecasting and anticipation. Okay. Whilst in an emergent perspective is much more of an understanding of the unpredictability of the world in which we work in today and live in today. Just from my own perspective there, as I've said, and we're going to talk about, I think in Unit 2, when we're going to look at more the economic foundations of strategic decision making, we're going to see how economic forecasting is very much a mug's game. Okay, to what extent can we forecast what's happening in the world in which we work and live in tomorrow or in 2 years' time? Okay, can we all predict? Would we predict, for example, in terms of the world of politics, that Donald J. Trump would become the president of the United States? Who forecast that? Maybe one of you did and won lots of money. I don't know. Forecasting is becoming increasingly difficult in a world in which things are very difficult to anticipate. We're living in a world today of great unpredictability, and to what extent companies therefore need to be looking at ways to be very agile, need to be able to be very ambidextrous in terms of their strategic thinking in order to maintain their strategic competitive advantage. They need to be able to make decisions quickly in order to change the policies of the company in order to maintain success. Okay. In terms of, again, looking towards the future, the emergent perspective will talk about flexibility and agility, making sure that you don't put too many eggs in one basket going forwards. Okay. At the same time, in the planning perspective, is the idea you need to make firm commitments, and in the result of that, prepare for the future, and then you have a chance to implement these moving forwards. Okay. In terms of implementation focus, a planning perspective will look at programming. We'll talk about efficient resource allocation, efficient organizational efficiency, which involves the programming, and allocation of resources in order to maintain successful strategic implementation, which in time will generate profit optimization. Okay, an emergent approach will be very different in that respect. It will focus on organizational learning. What can an organization learn from all of its actions? Even when, for example, a company undertakes seemingly fails in one of its objectives, what can an organization learn from that? And how does that feed back into the development of a company's strategy? Okay. Finally, when we're looking at the concept of strategic change, okay, again, the planning approach is inherently based on a hierarchical understanding of a company in terms of a CEO, chief executive officer, a senior management group who make the decisions, which then go down to the middle level management and then go down to junior management, which then go down into the lower levels of an organization. This very, very traditional understanding of a top-down kind of hierarchy within an organizational perspective. Okay, an emergent perspective in comparison requires an understanding of broad cultural and cognitive shifts. It looks at how we should be looking at how the firm is structured, how the firm is located in a given environment. How does it need to respond to cultural shifts? How does it need to respond in differences and shifts and changes in that environment as things take place? Is it important for the company to then respond very quickly in order to change its levels of strategic planning and different levels of resource allocation? These are some of the questions we need to think about. Okay. I hope you've enjoyed today's lecture. Just to provide some kind of overview to conclude, the aim of today's lecture is just to give you a brief kind of overview and summary of the genesis of the idea of strategy as process. And process is an important word to take home tonight, in terms of we need to understand how strategy within a firm is developed and understand the dynamism in this. It evolves over a period of time. The planning perspective, which we've talked about, is the kind of genesis of strategic planning, which came about through traditional military planning. The idea that a company, and mainly the senior management, can gather all the information they have available in terms of an external environment, in terms of the resources they have within the organization, and as a result of that, consider strategically how can we develop, how can we optimize the utilization of these resources in order to drive the company forwards. As a result of that, the strategic planning phase then moves onto a detached phase of strategic implementation, which you implement your plans. As a result of that, the aim is for the firm to create and maintain competitive advantage, and from that to gain profits. This process, as I've kind of mentioned, has been heavily critiqued, and as a result of that, there's developed a second kind of much broader emergent perspective in terms of strategic management, which takes into account how strategy evolves over a period of time. It takes into account how decision making within a company doesn't just take place in the boardroom. Strategies are taking place across a company all of the time, at the bottom levels, in the middle levels, at the top levels, and are constantly negotiating themselves with different things. Okay, the idea here is an understanding of the experimentation of strategy, how companies undertake actions, and from kind of, in many respects, dipping their toes into a new market, they then find out something about themselves and the market in which they're trying to enter, and they then change their actions accordingly. So it's an understanding, as I've stated, that strategy evolves over a period of time. Strategy within a company, whether it's a huge multinational company like BP, or it's a very small one-man company, computer company, or if it's a company in the public sector like a police force in New York City, or if it's a company like a medical services in Beijing in China, the strategy within these organizations is often shifting. And incredibly, and most importantly, this is very much important to take place in terms of the world in which we live in today, We live in a world of increasingly globalized organizational structures in which traditional forms of understanding are being challenged. So we see this kind of fragmentation and the unstructured nature of our strategic thinking. From this evolves the understanding that firms, in order to be successful, need to be, as I've mentioned a couple of times, strategically agile. They need to be able to respond to things quickly. They need to be able to change the markets in which they're doing business in. They need to be able to change their products and services. They need to have the capabilities, dynamic capabilities, and internal innovational capacities to be able to make these changes. There's a whole new kind of school of thought, for example, within the field of strategic management, which is called, and it's just of interest if anybody wants to read up about it, strategic ambidexterity. I repeat, strategic ambidexterity, which focuses on how firms generate the ability to respond to changes very, very quickly in the environments in which they're doing their work. And the idea of strategic ambidexterity and the emergent approach has developed as a result of the changes in the world in which we live in today. Whilst, for example, we can see that the planning perspective developed from the world of military planning in the 19th and 20th century, today in the 21st century, we see a different business environment. I was talking about the example of telecommunications and how Nokia was a market leader, then failed to build on that and didn't have the capacities to change and change quickly. Another classic example of that is the example of Kodak as a company which was a market leader in the 1970s and 80s, but then didn't have the ability to change when the internet emerged in the world in which we live and work in today. Okay, so they're just a few examples of some of the differences we're looking at in terms of the planning and emerging approaches to strategic management. In terms of things to think about after this lecture, maybe if you want, spend 5 minutes thinking about your own company, your own organization, to what extent there are planning and emergent perspectives to strategic management. What is your role within the organization? And try and think reflectively in terms of your own strategies. As I mentioned before, what are your strategies for learning, for example, in this MBA? And what are your strategies within the organization in which you work in terms of trying to progress your excuse me, trying to progress your own careers? If we can try and reflect on our own personal strategies, like we looked at Lady Gaga, of course, and she's just been making lots of pop songs and earning millions and millions of dollars, so she's done quite well. And let's try and reflect on our own personal strategies and see to what extent they align to the companies in which we work in. See to what extent parts of our personal strategies have been successful, or to what extent, excuse me, parts of our personal strategies have not been successful. Is it the case that our own personal strategies have been too hierarchical, have been too set, have been too formally structured? Is it the case that we shouldn't set clear objectives and state, in 2 years' time, I must achieve this goal? Is it the case of we need to understand them and need to be able to respond to the changing nature of the companies in which we do our business in? These are just some of the questions hopefully we can discuss during this module. Okay, and hopefully this first lecture on strategy as process will provide an important underlying message for the lectures that are going to continue during this module. We're going to be looking at, as I've stated, the economic foundations of strategic decision making. I've been talking today about the importance for a firm to gain competitive advantage. We're going to be learning about what are the economic foundations of this, okay, before looking at some of the issues around budgets. So in terms of strategic planning, how do we manage allocation of resources? How do we manage our budgets when we've got $100 million to spend on innovation? Where do we invest this money? All into the company in-house, or do we invest into foreign operations? These are some of the questions we need to look at. We look at further down the module, we're going to be looking at the corporate level strategies and also the business level strategies. Importantly, how does a company try and achieve an alignment? So the business level strategies developed coherently into the wider corporate level strategies of the organization. At the same time, finally, within this module, we're going to be looking at, as I mentioned, business ethics and corporate social responsibility. One of the most important things for understanding in the world in which we work and live in today is firms don't exist in a political vacuum. We also don't exist in isolation from our other students, from the organizations, from the businesses and worlds in which we live in. Okay, these are constantly evolving. As a result of that, whilst a company, for example, might want to be achieving profit maximization all of the time and achieving huge profits, as the example I gave you vis-a-vis Cambodia and Bangladesh in terms of garment manufacture, it's incredibly important for a company to understand its responsibilities in a world in which, for example, with the development of the internet, if a company makes a mistake or starts paying children to undertake labour, people get to know about this very quickly, and a company will receive bad publicity. And the result of that, it might take huge damages to the company, which then takes a lot of time for the company to recover. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed today's lecture. Thank you very much for listening. Bye bye. Bye bye. Bye.